Hey guys, it's Anders.
Blake.
And Adam from TV's Workaholics and the podcast This Is Important and the Pleasure Is Ours. We'd like to invite you to treat your friends and loved ones right by gifting them something from Trojan, America's #1 condom brand.
That's right. Trojan Bearskin Raw is America's thinnest latex condom, which helps you enjoy a more natural experience to feel it.
Oh, I feel you on that.
Wait, what?
So pick up some Trojan Bearskin Raw condoms, triple tested and trusted for over 100 years.
Trojan, do your best. Get yours on.
Becoming a magician takes thousands of hours, right, Ashley?
Oh, I'm not a magician. I'm a design specialist at the Container Store.
But you transform closets and pantries.
Well, I turn your most frustrating spaces into ones you love.
With a magic wand?
With Alpha, our customizable, adjustable, and affordable shelving and drawer system.
The amazing Ashley, making daily frustration disappear.
Just doing my job.
Transform your space with Alpha and save 20% on purchases over $500. Get started with your free design at the Container Store today.
Welcome to the Institute of Catholic Culture, a nonprofit Catholic organization dedicated to the re-evangelization of our society through educational and cultural programs offered to the public at no charge. This and other presentations, hundreds of hours of audio, are available for free on our website, www.instituteofcatholicculture.org. There you can listen to or download educational programs related to all aspects of our divine faith, and you can review our schedule of upcoming events. We hope you can join us in person.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we welcome back again Dr. Jeffrey Morrow for the conclusion of Deconstructing the Bible, the Crisis in Biblical Interpretation. Dr. Morrow, it's a pleasure to have you back.
It's a pleasure to be back. So hopefully we'll cover everything that's on the handout. We'll see. If not, the modernism lecture will take over from there, because that's how I hope to end, is how this crisis in biblical interpretation that we've been covering, the history of it, entered the Catholic world. And I think the modernist crisis is the important place where that happens. So I'm not going to review, and the last time I reviewed the session before, I'm not going to review that because we don't have a lot of time. And because those talks are available now on the website, and now there's handouts for each of those. So if you're interested in the prior talks, you can go to the website and look at that and refresh your memory. But where we left off, I believe we were talking about Johann David Michaelis, and I'm going to write these names in here now that Father Hezekiah he taught me how to do this. So I'm going to try to see if I can type the names in here. Johann David Michaelis. And his student, Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, and their engagement with the work of Jean Austruc. Now, Austruc is an important figure. He was a Jewish surgeon to King Louis XV of France. And just to refresh our memories, what he did was he felt inspired to defend the Bible and the tradition of Scripture against the criticism that it had received in the prior century, in the 17th century, in the hands of Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, and then that French guy no one's ever heard of, Isaac La Pereire. And so Austruc wrote this book, The Conjectures of Genesis, about Genesis. But what he did was he isolated what he believed to be many different source documents that Moses would have used. I believe he isolated something like 11 minor sources and then 2 major sources. And those are the really important ones for our discussion, right? He called source A, and the other he called source B. Now, in our first webinar, in the question and answer period, somebody asked about the documentary hypothesis. Well, this is part of that early stage. The stage was really set in the 17th century when these figures like Isaac Laperere and Spinoza and Father Richard Simon and Thomas Hobbes started to challenge the traditional view of who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we mentioned before how one of the important points that was understood in the 17th century, both by the defenders of the traditional view as well as the newer skeptics, was that if we can question Moses as the author of the Pentateuch or the compiler, well, maybe we can go further and question whether or not God revealed himself at Mount Sinai, whether or not God chose Israel as a people in history. And then, of course, you get out the 10 Commandments and things like that. Now, modern scholars can debate that and say, well, they're not connected. Those two issues are not connected. But in the 17th century, they were intimately connected, and that's exactly how this was used. Okay, so Ostrich sees that, and he comes to the defense of the tradition. So Michaelis thought that Ostrich had gone too far. One of the other factors here is that Moses served an important role in Michaelis. He wrote a multi-volume work on the laws of Moses that for him, this was his magnum opus. This was the most important thing he saw himself doing as a scholar. And he thought that the example of Moses specifically could be used for his contemporary German culture. And so for Ostrich to say, well, Moses is relying upon earlier sources, this was a problem for Michaelis. Although when we think about it, it's really not that shouldn't be that controversial in the sense that obviously Moses wasn't there for the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. If he's responsible for the final form of Genesis in some way, or he had to get those stories from somewhere, whether they were oral or written or whatever. But Michaelis took issue with the method that Ostrich used, somewhat providentially, because what we start to see is that's exactly what ends up happening throughout history, is they take this method of dividing up the sources based on vocabulary, style. It's all internal evidence, literary evidence, and it just snowballs down. And so what we see is this is where this figure of Eichhorn comes into play. Eichhorn was Michaelis' protege. He was the greatest Old Testament scholar of his age. And what he did, at first, he does not challenge the traditional view. So he wrote a very famous textbook. His textbook was used all over the place throughout Germany. And in those initial editions, he accepted Mosaic authorship. Now, he changes his mind by the end. All right, by the end of his career, he doesn't do that anymore. But early on, he accepted some form of Mosaic authorship. But what he did was he took Ostrich's work further, and he continued to divide these sources into further documentary sources, not just into the beginning of Exodus, which is where Ostrich stopped, because he figured, well, Moses was an eyewitness for the rest of it, therefore he didn't need to rely upon any other sources. Instead, what Eichhorn did was he said, no, to be consistent, if these various criteria, different names for God, right, different ways that God appears through dreams, through an angel, if these tell us that there was probably a different author or source in Genesis, well, what happens when we find those same different vocabulary and style in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? They must also tell us that there's different sources being used. And so that was kind of the position that Eichhorn went with. And so that actually becomes the foundation, for example, the names for God, right? He's called Yahweh, and then in other places he's called Elohim, right? Now there's a very easy response to this, which is one of the reasons that most scholars don't make this distinction anymore. The easy response is that Elohim is the generic name for God. In fact, it's actually plural. It means gods, right? The false gods of the nation. Or in the case of God, right? Elohim is one God. And Yahweh is his personal name that he reveals to Moses at the burning bush. So it's sort of like saying the Lord Jesus. Lord is the generic and Jesus is his personal name. But for the scholars of this time period, this becomes an indicator that there must be different authors involved. When I teach this to my students, what I like to tell them is it's an oversimplified example, but I like to give the example of, imagine there was a book being written about me, right? And let's say that in the odd chapters, I was referred to as Jeffrey Morrow. And in the even chapters, I was referred to as Professor Morrow. And somebody was reading this and they said, well, you know what? There seems to be two different sources involved. In the odd chapters, right, there's this J source for Jeffrey. And in the even chapters, there's a P source for Professor Morrow. But then, as people are reading the book more carefully, right, because it's so interesting, it's about my life after all, they start to realize that, well, I thought there were these different sources, but now as I read more carefully, some of these chapters have both Professor and Jeffrey Morrow. As opposed to saying, well, maybe we were wrong to see those as indicators of different authors, different sources. Maybe, instead what they do is they say, an editor must have come along and taken these different sources and put them together so that it looks like one author. That's overly simplified from what actually happens in history with the Pentateuch. But it does give you a sense of what happens. Right? I mean, all we have to do is think about Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, as this history of this documentary hypothesis plays out. Genesis chapter 3, we find both Yahweh and Elohim used. Right? Yahweh enters the garden, right? And yet the serpent speaks to Eve, the woman, of Elohim, right? And so the argument is, well, even though this is a Yahwistic source using J, the editor put in Elohim in there, and things of that nature. So what we start to see is at the ground level, this starts to build and have a great momentum. There's another thing I want to mention about Eichhorn that's very important, and that is his focus on myth and mythology. He's one of the early figures here who starts to use this category of myth to describe what we're finding in the Old Testament. Now, this is kind of the early stage of Romantic philosophy, and that's going to be very important as we approach the 19th century. And so what some of these biblical scholars did, inspired by Romantic philosophy, is they didn't see myth as necessarily something that wasn't, that was completely false. But this is how we use the term now. Somebody might say, if you go outside in the cold, you might catch a cold, right? Well, anybody who's studied medicine or biology knows that you catch colds from viruses, you get bacterial infections from bacteria, not from temperature, right? And so somebody might say, well, that's a myth. That's not how Eichhorn and others were using the term. What they're doing is they're not denying there's truth there. They're denying its historical value as a historical source. So there may be some philosophical truth or some other truth. Excuse me. But they're not seeing them as historically valuable. And that's significant. So that starts a whole chain of scholars arguing that we need to look at the Bible and isolate what's historical from what's mythical. Okay? So that's sort of where we left off in the last time. The next major scholar I want to mention here, I guess we should talk about what's going on with Jesus. What about Jesus? So New Testament and Old Testament scholarship is all developing at the same time. As I study the history, I'm convinced that the major trends begin with the Old Testament, and then they move to the study of the New Testament and to the study of Jesus and the historical Jesus. Most of the scholars we're covering, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority, are teaching both Old Testament and New Testament. They're publishing in both Old Testament and New Testament. But I'm going to focus on where they were most influential. So Eichhorn is most influential in the Old Testament. The figure I'm going to mention right now, Wilhelm de Wet, I'm typing this out for you, although it's also in the handout. Wilhelm de Wet, Wilhelm Martin Leberecht de Wet, worked in both Old and New Testaments, but he's most significant for the study of the Old Testament. All right. He continues the trends of Eichhorn. We're going to come back to him, though, because I want to talk about historical Jesus studies that's happening before Devet. I want to talk about the figure Samuel Herman Ramirez, spelling his name wrong. Right? Ramirez lived from 1694 to 1768. Now, when you read his works that were published under his name at the time, he seems very orthodox. He's a very orthodox Protestant theologian. It would have surprised you to realize that his doctoral dissertation was on a figure we covered in either the last section or maybe it was the first webinar, Machiavelli. So Ramirez was a student of Machiavelli. He didn't know him personally, but he studied his works. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Machiavelli. And so it should not surprise us that he was a religious dissembler of sorts. He was like Machiavelli's prince, except he didn't have the power of the prince. He was very much like John Toland in this sense as well. What Ramirez did is he put on this orthodox face. He wrote works defending traditional views of Christianity. But his private views were something quite different. Right? So in his private works, he tried to destabilize the text of Scripture. He wanted to deconstruct the Bible. And so he wrote quite a large amount showing why he believed the Old Testament miracles never happened, the New Testament miracles never happened, Jesus probably never rose from the dead, etc. We wouldn't even know about this except for Gotthold Lessing, right? Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. A number of historical Jesus scholars would argue that this is really the beginning of the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. Now, if you're not familiar with the various quests of the historical Jesus, that might sound like a good thing, right? And there are very beneficial aspects to it. One of my dear friends, Brant Petrie, he does his historical Jesus work. This is important work. But early on, what this meant was it created a distinction between eventually what was called the Jesus of history, on the one hand, what really happened, and the Christ of faith. Okay? And I would agree with Pope Benedict, who saw them as they're one and the same, right? The Christ of faith that we see in the Gospels is the most compelling historical account of Jesus, of who Jesus was and what he did. But that is not the view of the figures we're talking about right now, Lessing and Ramirez. So what Lessing does is he publishes Ramirez's works that were unpublished, his skeptical works. They're known to history as the Wolfenbüttel fragments. There's no umlaut there, but you can see it on the outline. The Wolfenbüttel fragments, because they were published in Wolfenbüttel, they're from Wolfenbüttel, where Ramirez had been a librarian. And so what Lessing does is he publishes these anonymously, and it causes this huge firestorm of controversy. And people start to write responses. But what also happens is that New Testament scholars start to take some of this material and they build upon it. They don't follow him everywhere, it's too controversial. But they start to build upon it. So as you walk through historical Jesus research, right, with David Friedrich Strauss and others, you start to see resonances with what Ramirez was doing that Lessing made public. There's another important figure during this time period that I'm going to mention. It's Ferdinand Christian Bauer. Ferdinand Christian Bauer. He was born in 1792 and he died in 1860, so he lived well into the 19th century. He's a contemporary of Devet, right? And Bauer was a church historian at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And he was so influential that he ended up creating a whole school of historical research. There were many, many scholars who followed his work. But the area of church history that he was most influential on was New Testament church history. So have you ever heard of that controversy between Peter and Paul? Right? You hear about this, obviously, in the letter to the Galatians. Well, Bauer is the one who argues first that controversy is an indication that Peter and Paul were completely at odds with each other. In fact, there was an entire church of St. Peter with all of his followers, and an entire church of St. Paul with all of his followers. And they didn't agree Now, we would see this as a little dispute. Okay, St. Peter, he's being a hypocrite. He'd already declared, as we see in Acts chapter 15, at the Council of Jerusalem, that we don't need to make distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. You don't need to be circumcised to follow Jesus. And here he is, not willing to eat with Gentiles because there's some circumcised followers here. Okay. He gets a fraternal correction, somewhat public. Case closed. It's done. He gets it. Paul was basically calling him to account to follow his own divinely inspired teachings. Well, Bauer wants to see this as a much larger thing. And this is, to this very day, this is pretty much the consistent picture we get among contemporary New Testament scholars in the 21st century. This is very common in the university classroom and the scholarship to see these warring factions in the early church. This comes back to Bauer, who was incredibly influenced by the work of John Toland and others, some of the ones we've covered in the last two webinars. So that's what's going on kind of in New Testament scholarship at this time. They're
Becoming a magician takes thousands of hours. Right, Ashley?
Oh, I'm not a magician. I'm a design specialist at the Container Store.
But you transform closets and pantries.
Well, I turn your most frustrating spaces into ones you love.
With a magic wand?
With Alpha, our customizable, adjustable, and affordable shelving and drawer system.
The amazing Ashley! Making daily frustration disappear.
Just doing my job.
Transform your space with Alpha and save 20% on purchases over $500. Get started with your free design at the Container Store today.
Now extended through January 14th, join a clean and spacious Planet Fitness for zero enrollment and only $10 a month. With tons of equipment and free fitness training, it's the perfect place for everybody to work out.
Even me, mister. I'm so stressed I grind my teeth more than most people grind coffee.
Especially you. Give your anxiety-clenched jaw a rest.
My molars will be so happy.
Start feeling fit-tacular today. Join in club or at planetfitness.com. Zero enrollment, $10 a month, cancel anytime. Deal ends January 14th. See club for details.
challenging the Jesus of the Gospels. Did he really do that? Well, I'm not so sure. Did he walk in water?
Hey, it's Nikki Glazer. And even reading about Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condoms is kind of getting me juiced up, if you know what I'm saying. Each Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condom has ultra smooth premium lubricant inside and out for a more natural feel. You guys know I love lube. I don't leave home without it. And now I'll leave my bottle at home and just bring the condoms. Also, they have extra deep ribs at the base and end to increase stimulation. So these condoms are for both of you, really. This condom has a unique design that lets you feel the pleasure and not the condom. To be honest with you, if I went out with a guy and when we're getting down, he brings out a Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condom, I'd be like, this dude knows what he's doing and he's considered me in this. Thank you. When I think condoms, I think Trojan condoms. So try Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condoms. Triple tested and trusted for over 100 years. Feel your best. Get yours on.
Calling all partners. Losing weight is better together with Nutrisystem's Partner Plan. In fact, people who diet together lose 20% more weight than dieting on their own. Get new premium meals with up to 30 grams of protein. They're big and filling and taste delicious. Plus, try our new restaurant faves that taste like your favorite restaurant, portioned with half the calories. Don't wait. You could win big cash during Nutrisystem's Better Together Partner Plan 100K giveaway. And maybe win the grand prize of $25,000. Just go to Nutrisystem.com/thin right now and get 50% off plus an extra $50 off your first month. You heard me right. Go to Nutrisystem.com/thin right now and get 50% off plus an extra $50 off. Don't wait. This partner plan offer will not last long. Just go to Nutrisystem.com/thin right now and get 50% off plus an extra $50 off. Go to Nutrisystem.com/thin.
See website for details on our 2-month subscription offer. No purchase necessary. Open only to U.S. residents over 21. Void where prohibited. Runs December 25 through April 4th, 2022. For official rules, visit Nutrisystem.com. Sponsored by Nutrisystem, Inc.
Or, who walks in water? That just doesn't happen, all right? Why would God suspend the laws that he...
Hello, Discover here to explain our cash back match. Here's how it works. We give you cash back for using your Discover card on the things you were going to buy anyway. Then we match that cash back in your first year. And that's why we call it Cashback Match. Now to recap and say cashback one more time. We match all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year automatically. Discover. Exceptionally common sense. Learn more at discover.com/match. Limitations apply.
Whatever business you're in, growth isn't just about getting bigger. At ADP, we believe it's about getting stronger by turning data into insights so you can build teams that work as teams. By using our AI technology to help catch payroll errors before they're errors. And by keeping ahead of thousands of changing regulations so you can keep ahead of everything else. ADP helps businesses like yours grow stronger every day. ADP, HR, talent, time, and payroll.
That's just nonsense. And these kind of warring.
Hey, it's Nikki Glazer. And even reading about Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condoms is kind of getting me juiced up, if you know what I'm saying. Each Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condom has ultra smooth premium lubricant inside and out for a more natural feel. You guys know I love lube. I don't leave home without it. And now I'll leave my bottle at home and just bring the condoms. Also, they have extra deep ribs at the base and end to increase stimulation. So these condoms are for both of you, really. This condom has a unique design that lets you feel the pleasure and not the condom. To be honest with you, if I went out with a guy and when we're getting down, he brings out a Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condom, I'd be like, this dude knows what he's doing and he's considered me in this. Thank you. When I think condoms, I think Trojan condoms. So try Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condoms. Triple tested and trusted for over 100 years. Feel your best. Get yours on.
Becoming a magician takes thousands of hours. Right, Ashley?
Oh, I'm not a magician. I'm a design specialist at the Container Store.
But you transform closets and pantries.
Well, I turn your most frustrating spaces into ones you love.
With a magic wand?
With Alpha, our customizable, adjustable, and affordable shelving and drawer system.
The amazing Ashley! Making daily frustration disappear.
Just doing my job.
Transform your space with Alpha and save 20% on purchases over $500. Get started with your free design at the Container Store today.
Communities in the New Testament, basically reading in Protestant fragmentation.
Progressive presents Forced Metaphors about bundling your home and auto.
In sports, 3 goals is a hat trick. And when you bundle your home and auto with Progressive, you get a hat trick of great savings and round-the-clock protection. So you might be thinking, wait, that's 2 things. A hat trick is 3. But in this metaphor, great savings counts as 2 goals, and so does round-the-clock protection. So it's like 4 goals, and that's more than 3. It's basic math.
Forced Metaphors. Presented by Progressive. Bundle and protect today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Discount not available in all states or situations.
Hey, Randy. What you doing?
Oh, hey, Dave. I'm just making a list of things that make me feel really, really good.
Wearing Bombas socks.
Trust me, that's number 1 on my list. Bombas socks feel so good because we use the smartest design and best materials, making them the most comfortable socks ever.
Plus, because socks are the number 1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters, we donate a pair for every pair purchased, and that feels pretty good too.
To shop Bombas or learn more about how your purchase supports those experiencing homelessness, go to bombas.com/comfy and get 20% off your first purchase.
From the Protestant Reformation or Revolution into the texts in light of their own 18th and 19th.
Becoming a magician takes thousands of hours. Right, Ashley?
Oh, I'm not a magician. I'm a design specialist at the Container Store.
But you transform closets and pantries.
Well, I turn your most frustrating spaces into ones you love.
With a magic wand?
With Alpha, our customizable, adjustable, and affordable shelving and drawer system.
The amazing Ashley! Making daily frustration disappear.
Just doing my job.
Transform your space with Alpha and save 20% on purchases over $500. Get started with your free design at the Container Store today.
Socks are the number 1 most requested item in homeless shelters. Underwear is the second, shirts are third. At Bombas, socks were first, made with comfortable details for everyday wearing. Then underwear and shirts too, all designed to perfectly fit. At Bombas, every item you purchase means you're donating an essential clothing item to someone in need. 1 comfortable clothing item for you, 1 donated to someone in need. Bombas, comfort for all. Get 20% off your purchase at bombas.com/comfy.
19th century political disputes that are going on. So Wilhelm de Wet, let me talk a little bit about his.
You coming to bed, hon?
Yep, honey, I'll be right there. Just gotta turn out the light. Ow! 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 Ah! Gah!
Some things never change. Like your kids always leaving tiny toys on the floor for you to step on. And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Sweetie, I think I left the downstairs light on.
Please don't make me go.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Socks are the number 1 most requested item in homeless shelters. Underwear is the second, shirts are third. At Bombas, socks were first. Made with comfortable details for everyday wearing. Then underwear and shirts too. All designed to perfectly fit. At Bombas, every item you purchase means you're donating an essential clothing item to someone in need. One comfortable clothing item for you, one donated to someone in need. Bombas, comfort for all. Get 20% off your purchase at bombas.com/comfy.
Importance here. Why is the vet so important? The vet's important because there's a real problem.
Hey, it's Nikki Glazer. And even reading about Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condoms is kind of getting me juiced up, if you know what I'm saying. Each Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Rib condom has ultra smooth premium lubricant inside and out for a more natural feel. You guys know I love lube. I don't leave home without it. And now I'll leave my bottle at home and just bring the condoms. Also, they have extra deep ribs at the base and end to increase stimulation. So these condoms are for both of you, really. This condom has a unique design that lets you feel the pleasure and not the condom. To be honest with you, if I went out with a guy and when we're getting down, he brings out a Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condom, I'd be like, this dude knows what he's doing and he's considered me in this. Thank you. When I think condoms, I think Trojan condoms. So try Trojan Ecstasy Ultra Ribbed condoms. Triple tested and trusted for over 100 years. Feel your best. Get yours on.
At ADP, we understand the importance of building the right team and offer the data insights to help. Just as importantly, our AI technology helps you pay the team accurately. Grow stronger with ADP. HR, talent, time, and payroll.
Eichhorn's work and the others that follow him, Carl Ilgel and others that we don't need to talk about right now, as they're developing this.
Hey, it's Nikki Glazer. I want you to get everything you want. And the thing I want you to get the most? Laid. Yeah, that's right. I want you to have sex. And what better way to have sex than to use Trojan Bearskin Raw condoms? Cuddle up on that bearskin rug, throw on a bearskin condom, and it'll feel as close to the real thing as possible. They're triple tested and trusted for over 100 years, with silky smooth lubricant to increase comfort and sensitivity. Don't be you gotta wear a condom. They're cool. Buy them, share them, gift them, wear them. Grow up and get Trojan Bearskin Raw condoms. Trojan, America's #1 condom brand. Feel your best and get yours on.
You coming to bed, hon?
Yep, honey, I'll be right there. Just gotta turn out the light. Ow! 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 Ah! Go!
Some things never change. Like your kids always leaving tiny toys on the floor for you to step on. And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Sweetie, I think I left the downstairs light on.
Please don't make me go.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
This acid, in a sense, dissolve scripture into multiple fragments.
Family. It looks a little different for everyone. For some, it's mom and dad. For others, roommates who feel like family. And for others, it's your significant other, their golfing buddies, your children, a high school soccer team starting lineup, and oh look, they're all taking you up on the offer to stay for dinner, really testing the limits of that phrase, the more the merrier. But no matter where you call home, Geico makes it easy to bundle and save on home and car insurance. Easier than making 3 frozen pizzas and assorted frozen veggies into a cohesive meal.
Becoming a magician takes thousands of hours, right, Ashley?
Oh, I'm not a magician. I'm a design specialist at the Container Store.
But you transform closets and pantries.
Well, I turn your most frustrating spaces into ones you love.
With a magic wand?
With Alpha, our customizable, adjustable, and affordable shelving and drawer system.
The amazing Ashley! Making daily frustration disappear.
Just doing my job.
Transform your space with Alpha and save 20% on purchases over $500. Get started with your free design at the Container Store today.
A problem arises, right? The Samaritan Pentateuch. This is not a new document. Scholars have known about this since prior to Father Richard Simon. Samaritans are still a live community to this day. If you go to Israel, you can see Samaritans. They still exist to this day. The Samaritans have their own Pentateuch. They have their own Torah. And it's very similar to the Torah we all use, the Pentateuch we use. It's written in the Samaritan language. Right, so they have a Samaritan dialect of Aramaic, and they have a Samaritan dialect of Hebrew. So they have both forms. They have their liturgical Pentateuch that they would use in their liturgy in Hebrew, in the Samaritan script, and they have one that's more common for their everyday use in Aramaic, which is their native language, Samaritan Aramaic. There are some differences. So, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, the central sanctuary where they will worship is Mount Ebal. In the Samaritan Pentateuch, it is Mount Gerizim. Oh, I misspelled that. Sorry about that. And the reason that it is Gerizim is that that's where their temple is to this day. Right? The Samaritans worship at Gerizim. Right? We see this in the Gospel of John when Jesus is speaking with the woman at the well. Right? We worship in this mountain, but you Jews say it's in Jerusalem that we should worship. And Jesus says the hour is coming where it will neither be there nor here, but you will. The true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. So this is kind of that debate. But other than these few passages where the Samaritans have a text that represents their theological views, the entire Pentateuch is the same. Why is that a problem? Because, again, this is not fully formed by DeVette's time, but as we get into the 19th century, isn't the Pentateuch written not by Moses, but by the J source, maybe as early as the 10th century, maybe later, and the E source? And isn't the J source a southern text? Right. This is what we taught in the classroom. Genesis 1 was written after the Babylonian exile by a priestly source, right, in Jerusalem. Genesis 2 and following was written by the Yahwistic source, supporting the southern kingdom after north and south split. Right. It's all politics. Well, that's because for these biblical scholars, they are entrenched in political conflict, as we're going to see in a few minutes here. So the problem becomes, why would the Samaritans, descendants of the northerners, after the split between north and south, why would they have southern texts? If the J texts, right, Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, Genesis 15, if those were written to support the Davidic kingdom after north and south have split, why would the northerners take these texts which don't support their views, but support the Davidic king? Shouldn't they just have E? I mean, that's really where this comes down to, is if all this is true, if Deuteronomy is a southern text, right, that's what I was taught. Deuteronomy is from the south. And it uses, Yahweh, just like the Yahwist does. Well, if it's a southern text, why does it have Mount Ebal as the central sanctuary? Mount Ebal is in the north. It's by Shechem. It's actually not that far from Mount Gerizim. Anyway, they say it's southern. Okay. But if it's southern, why would the northern Samaritans have the whole book of Deuteronomy? And they do. There says it's Mount Gerizim. But they have Deuteronomy. Why would they have the priestly source? Isn't the priestly source coming from the priests who have newly come into power after the Babylonian exile? And they're trying to, this is where circumcision comes from. This is where the Sabbath comes from, the Jubilee tradition, the tithing to the priests. All of these traditions are there. Why? Because you have these priests who are coming to power. They want to rule the people that are now freed from Babylonian exile. And how are they going to do it? Through rules that they're going to create and write stories saying, of course you have to give us a tenth of everything. Why? Because God said so way back when. You weren't aware of that? Well, here's the text. That's how this gets used. But that's the question. Why would the Samaritans have all of these texts? On this theory, they basically should just have the northern Elohistic texts. They should not have Genesis 17, the account of circumcision. They should have a portion of Genesis 22, maybe not all of it, because the scholars argue that Genesis 22, with the binding of Isaac, is a combination of J and E texts. More detail than you need. But the point is, the Samaritan Pentateuch, its very existence is a problem for this theory. So what does DeVette do? DeVette argues that there is a long history of cordial relations between the North and the South. He creates this story, this narrative, where North and South were working together, and the northern priests We're getting advice from the southern priests, and nobody really challenges that. It just kind of brushes away the problem of the Samaritan Pentateuch. All of a sudden, it's no longer a problem. Now we have an explanation for why they would later in the history start adopting the Pentateuch of the South as it is developing, as it is filling out. And then what DeVette does is he dates Deuteronomy very late. Once that piece is there, all the pieces are kind of set in place for Wellhausen later to come up with a more robust form of what we know of as the documentary hypothesis, right? Again, DeVette is also very influenced by Romantic philosophy. He wants to follow that mythic tradition of Eichhorn. The big problem he has is rationalism, okay? So you have the work of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. I didn't put this in the handout, but this is some important background to think about. You have the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and Kant's work is overly rationalistic for DeVette. It doesn't give him a reason, right, to pray to God. Kant prayed to God. These figures we're talking about believed in God. They prayed. But for DeVette, the reason was insufficient. He needed something for the heart. And so he found this in Romantic philosophy, right, the Romantic philosophy of figures like Herder and Scheller. One important figure for him was this figure, Jakob Fries. Fries was important because he saw Fries as a mediating figure, somewhat like Immanuel Kant, rationalistic. He used reason, but there was also this acceptance of things that did not appear completely reasonable, that moved the passions, the heart, the senses. And that's kind of where DeVette went. So he thought there were some very good religious teachings we could learn from the myths of the Old Testament. But that's a whole other thing than understanding them as historical. And that's kind of where we are in the early to middle part of the 19th century. I want to move to two major German figures, all right, Julius Wellhausen and Heinrich Holtzmann. But before I do, I want to give a little context here. I'm not sure if we'll get through this in the first half, and that's okay, because we're doing okay. But the context I want to mention is the Kulturkampf. Kulturkampf, this is a fancy German word for Kultur, culture, Kampf, struggle, conflict, war, strife. It's a culture strife. What this refers to, in the context of history, is basically the 1870s, when Otto von Bismarck was trying to unify Germany. He was the Protestant Prussian ruler, right, who started to unify Germany. And this became a big issue, an all-encompassing issue. And what the Kulturkampf was basically a struggle against the Catholic Church in Germany. I'm going to talk a little bit about this because this becomes the context for Holtzmann's work as well as Wellhausen's work. All right. So the 1850s saw this amazing Catholic revival. I was just using this book recently. Do I have it on hand? I do. I'm just going to pull this book real quickly here. It's an excellent book. All right, I highly recommend it. It's a doctoral dissertation, but it's very good. It's called The War Against Catholicism. Okay, the war, I have it in the notes, in the outline, I mentioned it. The War Against Catholicism, Liberalism, and the Anti-Catholic Imagination in 19th Century Germany. It's a doctoral dissertation, but it's very well written. It's not that difficult to read. It might be tedious at points if you're not into that sort of history, but it's an excellent book. And what he shows is this kind of unexamined history of what was going on in the 1850s that led up to the Kulturkampf. Right? So just so you know, Kulturkampf was crazy. I mean, it's not as bad as the Civil War in Spain, not as bad as it's not as bad as certain things that happened later, but it was crazy. Many of the religious orders, including the Jesuits in Germany, were kicked out. They had to leave. Right? It was in some ways similar to what was going on in the Reformation. Monasteries were liquidated. Those monasteries became state land. The state took the money from them. There was all sorts of explicitly Catholic legislation coming out, being promulgated and enforced. Now, not all of the monasteries and not all of the religious orders were kicked out because Some of them served these kind of just essential education functions that the state couldn't deal without. But it's been an important part of the history. And what a lot of scholars will say is this is an aberration. This is so odd. This is not what you would expect. And what Michael Gross does in this volume is he shows that this is not the case at all. In fact, I'm going to quote from here just for a minute because I have you as a captive audience. This is worth reading. What he says is, while most accounts of the Kulturkampf give the impression that the anti-Catholic campaign arose spontaneously and suddenly at the beginning of the 1870s, and therefore provide little sense of the wide and deep-running anti-Jesuit, anti-monastic, and anti-Catholic hysteria prior to German unification. The groundwork that made the Kulturkampf possible was in fact prepared over a period of decades. The anti-Jesuit paranoia, rabid anti-monasticism, and anti-clericalism, and fervent anti-Catholicism that explain the passion of the Kulturkampf developed along with a dramatic revival of popular Catholicism during the 1850s and 1860s. And that was a large quotation from his book. And it's so true. What I think we fail to realize is that in the 1850s, these Catholic revivals, not only did they help set Catholics on fire in a very positive sense, not literally, not like religious burnings at the stake, but just set them on fire for God, for their faith, the church, and the sacraments, getting people to confession. But there were loads of Protestants and even Jews who were participating in the revivals. It's absolutely amazing that people would leave work and they would go and participate in these very explicitly Catholic revivals. They didn't all become Catholic, but it got them excited about their own faiths, taking their faith seriously. It's kind of an amazing phenomenon. The point I'm trying to make is that the revivals, you couldn't ignore them. And so when the state was trying to unify, it started to see, Bismarck and the people supporting his Kulturkampf started to see that there's this big obstacle here, and that is the Catholic Church. Why? Because it's got a lot of land. And where are these Carthusians coming from? These Carmelites, these Jesuits. We got some of them from Spain and Italy. Of course, there is no Italy yet, right? It's becoming Italy. We've got them from all over, not from here. I mean, some of them are from Germany. The point is they're coming from outside. They're foreigners. And moreover, they support the Pope. I think we mentioned in an earlier session this issue of episcopal appointment. Who gets to appoint bishops? Well, in Germany, most of the bishops were appointed by the state, right? And the religious orders circumvented all of that. So they were seen as foreigners and as potential threats to the security of the state. That's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Of course, what's the big event that happens in 1870? Of course, your volumes are all muted, so I can't hear any of you. But I know you all know the First Vatican Council, right? The First Vatican Council closes in 1870, closes early, because Pius IX and the Papal States, the Vatican is being protected by these French troops. They're invaded by the Piedmontese under Gregory XVI, right, prior to Pius IX. This is a real problem. What do we do? And so help the Pope. And so people come to support the Pope, especially the French. And so the French troops are basically the only thing between Pius IX, the Pope at the time, and the hopefully invading troops. They're going to take over the Vatican. What happens in 1870? The Franco-Prussian War breaks out between the French and the Prussians. And so the French troops have to leave protecting the Vatican, and they go and they help fight the Prussians, right? Bismarck and others. And the Piedmontese come in, and the Pope becomes a prisoner of the Vatican. Vatican I ends, and no more papal states. There's no more, ever again, to this day, papal states. Right? So we get Vatican City with the Concordat with Mussolini later. That's in the 20th century. But all this politics is important because it gives you a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. The broader Prussian, Protestant, political context in which Wellhausen and Holtzmann are working is one that is anti-Catholic, anti-Jesuit, right? Anti-ritual, anti-sacrament, anti-priesthood. All of that is there. And that's all important to keep in the back of our heads as we're walking through this history. All right? So that's all going on behind the scenes. Now, I want to mention a couple things taking us back to the 18th century with Michaelis and Göttingen and tying us in here, is that ever since the foundation of the University of Göttingen and these Enlightenment universities, some of them are reconstituted. In the case of Göttingen, it is formed for the first time. They're trying to create good civil servants for the state. Initially King George, but eventually just the German state. And what happens is all of the faculty, the professors, are civil servants. They're all functionaries of the state. And we think about this, and it's hard really to get our minds around this. But they work in many ways behind the scenes. The example I gave on the outline is the later figure, Adolf von Harnack, right, who lived into the 20th century. And Harnack was the figure who drafted the letter defending Germany's entrance into World War I. And this was a normal thing. This is what professors did. They were the ones, so the Kaiser would write, send a letter with his name, and it was really written by, a church history professor. And so this is important to keep in mind. These are people who have a very vested political interest in what they're doing, and they're very attuned to these things. All right, so case in point, Wellhausen and Holtzmann. Maybe I should start with Holtzmann. I'll start with Holtzmann, even though in the outline I start with Wellhausen. Holtzmann is important for what becomes known as the two-source hypothesis for the gospel composition. As I mentioned in the outline, right, there's this thing called the synoptic problem. Right? It refers to the synoptic gospels. Right? The synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right? Syn in Greek together. Oh, I misspelled that. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm still getting used to this high technology stuff. So syn, I write with a pen and paper. Syn together, right? Optic from the word for eyes. So you see it together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as you read through these, you start to see that, gosh, their chronologies are very similar. They have a lot of the same stories. There's differences, a lot of differences. But they seem a lot more similar than, say, the Gospel of John, even though there's similarities there too. And so what has always been known, I mean, this is already the origin, St. Augustine, the early centuries of Christianity, is that a lot of Mark, for example, is in Matthew and Luke. They share a lot of these texts, words, phrases, stories in common. So how do we account for that? That's what's known as the synoptic problem. How do we account for that? And so this figure, Jakob Griesbach, comes along in the 1700s, I'm sorry, in the 1800s. Actually, no, he's a contemporary of Michaelis. Date's not in front of me, it's not in my head, but it's on the outline. So Griesbach comes along. He's a contemporary of Michaelis, a little bit after, I think, as well. And he argues, I believe in the 1700s, he argues that Matthew was first, right, the first gospel written. That is the consistent universal tradition of the church from earliest times until the 1860s, basically. And what Griesbach argues then is that what happens is this. He's going to tweak St. Augustine's view. And when he tweaks it is he says that Matthew was first, and then Luke used Matthew when he was writing his account. Which doesn't stretch, doesn't strain credibility too much. Luke says he uses other sources. And then what Griesbach does is he argues that Mark also used Matthew and Luke. And the tradition, of course, that we have from Papias in the 200s, which is preserved for us in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History in the 300s, 4th century, is that Mark is summarizing Peter's preaching in Rome. So he's using a gospel that basically represents St. Peter's preaching, the first pope. Now, I'm not going to get into the newer theories and what's going on, what actually happened. But what Griesbach wants to argue is Mark is using Matthew and Luke. So Holtzmann enters this history in the 1860s, Right? Holtzmann was born in 1832, died in 1910. And I believe it was 1863. It's on the outline. He argues in print that no. Matthew's not first. Mark is first. There's a lot of reasons for this. It's the shortest, it's the simplest, blah, blah, blah. So he argues that Mark is the first gospel, and that Matthew and Luke both use Mark. Now, nobody basically followed him. There were a lot of refutations. People were fairly persuaded by the refutations of Holtzmann. Okay? But then enter 1870, and then 1872, and we can go forward in time. All of a sudden, in the 1870s, during the Kulturkampf, and into the 1880s, Holtzmann's view begins to gain traction. It begins to gain a following in the German-speaking world. And then in the early 20th century, it takes off. You are hard-pressed, I tell you right now, you are hard-pressed to find in the English and German-speaking world scholars who argue that Matthew was first. They exist. I know a lot of them, the few, my friends, myself, but we are few and far between. The majority of scholars now in the English and German-speaking world, and it doesn't matter if they're evangelical Protestant, if they're more liberal Protestant, Catholic, whatever. I've heard homilies at Catholic masses. I've heard homilies going on about mark and priority and Q, right, the Q source, which accounts for passages that are similar in Matthew and Luke, but nowhere else. So this becomes widespread. Why did it become widespread, and why after Vatican I? It's not just the 1870s, it's Vatican I. Well, because Vatican I defined solemnly the authority of the Pope, papal infallibility. The right, which none of you will find as radical, but it was radical, the absolute right of the Pope to be able to communicate directly with his bishops, regardless of where they were. Why is that so radical? Because states were arguing that the Pope did not have that right. He had absolutely no right to communicate directly with their appointed bishops, unless they say so. So Vatican I says absolutely not. Pope has the right to communicate directly with his people. So when it came to papal authority, where did the church go? Where did it go? Matthew chapter 16. You do a whole webinar just on that, right? Matthew chapter 16, right? Jesus says, you are Peter. And upon this Peter, this Petra, this rock, I will build my church, right? You are, in the Aramaic, it would be Kepha. You are Kepha, upon this Kepha, right? In the Greek, he is Petros, the masculine form of Petra. And the reason for using Petra, that feminine form, sorry for the tangent, is because that's what the Dome of the Rock was called. The rock, the Evan Shetia, the rock that the temple was built upon was the Petra, right? So that in Matthew 7, when we hear Jesus talk about the wise and foolish builders, the wise man builds his house on the Petra. So he's making a link between Peter and the rock of the temple, so the new church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay? Luke chapter 22, where Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has determined to sift you like wheat. Many English translations obscure the Greek here. Actually, it's better if you look at some of the foreign translations. But the Greek actually says, Simon, Simon, Satan has determined to sift you. It's plural you, all of you, y'all, like wheat. But I have prayed for you, singular, Simon Peter, that when you come back, when you return, strengthen your brothers. He's singling Simon Peter out there. John 21. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Right? Domine tu omnia nosti tu scisquia amote. Lord, you know all things, you know that I love you. What does Jesus say to him? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my flock. Well, who does that? The shepherd. Well, who's the good shepherd? Jesus. Just as God is the good shepherd in the old. Jesus, in John's gospel, is the good shepherd. He is God. And he is entrusting that shepherding ministry to St. Peter and thus his successors. Those are what are cited in Pastor Eternus of Vatican I. Not Mark. You could cite Mark. There's a lot of Petrine stuff in Mark, but it doesn't. And so what starts to develop is this argument in the Prussian state of Germany that Mark is the earliest gospel, right? Mark doesn't have all those Catholic embellishments from the early Catholic Church. of Matthew 16, Luke 22, John 21. It doesn't have any of that. That was all added in later in these debates between the Petrine Church and these other churches. No, the earliest gospel is Mark. And therefore, there's no supremacy of Peter or the Pope. So this became enforced in the German universities. If you wanted to get promoted, if you wanted to get tenure, if you wanted to get a job, you basically had to hold a Markan priority. This becomes really important, actually. Now, I don't mention this in the outline, but there's a fantastic book on the history of the discipline of history in the United States by a man named Peter Novick called That Noble Dream, right? It's the quest of objectivity in the history disciplines. And one of the things he shows is how in all these disciplines of history, and it worked for biblical studies as well, these scholars, English-speaking scholars, particularly in the United States, were being trained in Germany by these German historians. And so this stuff spread like wildfire. There's another figure involved, which we'll mention after the break, in disseminating this stuff among the English-speaking world. Suffice it to say, this became the mainstream view in the German academy and what was going on in Germany. We could say a lot about that, but instead I want to turn our focus to Julius Wellhausen. I know I only have a few minutes before the break, but I'm going to take those minutes. So Wellhausen is a very important figure here. He also wrote on the New Testament. He also followed Holtzmann in the Markan priority. But I don't want to focus on that. Nobody knows about him for that. They know about him because of the documentary Hypothesis. He gave it its most clear expression. The main textbook version is still circulated today in textbooks around the world, even though you're not going to find scholars who adhere to this classic formulation anymore. They don't exist really anymore. They'll tweak it. Maybe there's no J, there's just the E, D, and P. Maybe there's no E, it's just J, D, and P we split into P and H. And of course there's levels. There's E1, E2, E3, J1, J2, J3, etc. It's really complicated, really fast. And now they're moving into a fragmentary hypothesis, which is closer to what DeWet was arguing, more or less, where there's no documentary sources, just little bits and patches and little stamp-sized fragments, millions of them all over the place. They just kind of get sewn together by varying layers of editors. Well, Wellhausen's key here. Wellhausen was a staunch Bismarck supporter. And he hated the Torah, the Pentateuch. He loved the prophets. Surprise, liberal Protestant in Germany. Loved the prophets. Down with ritual, boo, tradition, right? But he had never read the Torah until much later in life. So he's writing this Prolegomena zur Geschichte Israels, right? The Prolegomena, the history of Israel, which was a revision of his earlier Geschichte Israels, history of Israel, which I mentioned in the outline. And he kind of gives us a little bit, he lifts the veil a little bit, tells us what's really going on. And what he says is, he felt bad, he felt guilty that he had not read the Pentateuch. Aren't the prophets based in the Pentateuch? And so what he does is he reads the Pentateuch and he hates it. Ritual, sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. This is horrible. This is bad. What am I supposed to do? He's depressed. I can't even read the prophets anymore. What am I supposed to do? And then he says that he finds out that Karl Heinrich Graf, he heard, dated the Pentateuch to after the time of the prophets. And this is what he says. He says, almost without knowing the reasons, I accepted that this is probably true. Right? That's not quite a word-for-word quote, but pretty darn close. It's pretty close. You can find it, page 4 of his Prolegomena, both in English and in German. It's amazing. And we'll leave it at that. Let's stop here for that. This is a good stopping point. He builds his theory, right, based on that starting point. So we'll stop there for now, and we'll continue after the break. So we left off with Wellhausen. And by the way, so this is the book that Scott Hahn and I are working on right now is taking all this history basically from Michaelis through Wellhausen. So I'm working on this actively right now. So when it comes out, you have to read the book. That'll give you much more detail. It'll be much better. Wellhausen's very, very important. He really was revered and still is in many ways as the most important Old Testament scholar from the 1870s to till he died in 1918. He's made an honorary member of all these American associations, really a giant, leading giant. He helped out with Paul Haupt's Polychrome Bible, where they went through the sources, they color-coded them. Haupt was a German scholar who ended up being a professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. It's not that important right now. But the point about Wellhausen is very important. He became incredibly influential all over the world. Even those who couldn't read German, right, were influenced by his work, as we'll see in a minute. So Wellhausen starts to argue this. What he does is he builds upon the work of others. A lot of names, you don't really need to know them right now, but Graf is an important one. Even his own teacher, Heinrich Ewald, they had a falling out politically. There are many of these figures that became important. So he's really building on the work of all of them, but he's synthesizing. He's a great synthesizer of these theories. And so he comes up with this cogent view, right? So he says that, the priests are influenced they're interested in ritual, sacrifice, stuff like that. The cleanliness laws, right? In the Yahwistic accounts, God appears like a man walking in the garden. In the Elohistic accounts, he appears either through an angel or mediated in a dream, etc. It's very kind of clear cut. And he has a fairly intricate editorial layer scheme here that's not usually taught in introductory textbooks. I'm not going to get into that. It's not that important right now. But he does have, he's a little bit more nuanced. He's aware of some of the problems actually in his theory. He's pretty much aware of that. The other thing I would say is, as Danny was mentioning before, it didn't have a lot of biblical scholarship behind it. It had a lot of biblical scholarship behind it, but what Wellhausen did not do, and he could have done in the sense that he had the skill set, and he was criticized even by his friends at the time, was he didn't really use any comparable ancient Near Eastern material. I just read an article that says that in his private views near the end of his life, he said, okay, maybe we should. But he never did anything with that. And in fact, early on, he explicitly argues against that. Well, now what I mean by that is that the 19th century, and especially the 20th century, but the 19th century was really the age of archaeology. It really was beginning to boom. And it was a new discipline, and material remains, cuneiform tablets and such, were just popping out of the ground, left and right. And that continued well into the 20th century. It's still happening today. And he could read cuneiform, right? So Wellhausen knew Akkadian. At one point, the scholars who study that are called Assyriologists. He actually considered becoming an Assyriologist at one point in his career. But he didn't do it. I think he had like 3 minor publications on Assyriology. Peter Machinist at Harvard University did an article a few years ago, a very lengthy one, called The Path Not Taken. And it's on Wellhausen and Assyriology where he deals with this. So Wellhausen argued that you want to understand the Old Testament, just look at the Old Testament. You don't need to go elsewhere to understand the cultural background and things of that nature. So his view was completely internal. And this is one of those great ironies I bring up with my students when we're talking about historical criticism, because the method is called historical criticism. And so I'll ask you as I ask them, though you're not going to answer me. When you think of historical disciplines, where do you go? What's historical? Right? And the responses are usually pretty good. You look to other ancient documents, archaeological artifacts, clay pots, digging in the field, etc. That's pretty good. That is not what historical criticism does. Now, when I say that, I'm using kind of the textbook narrow definition of historical criticism, which now is divided into 3 forms: source, form, and redaction. In Wellhausen's day, it was basically source, and form was just getting off the ground. Okay, and the idea of source criticism looks at hypothetical documents, literary documents behind a text. We don't know if they ever really existed, right? The clues to them is not that we found the document. Rather, it's, I'm reading this chapter, and there's different phrases I'm finding from the earlier chapter, and I'm seeing different names pop up, things like that. Or, didn't we just hear about this, right? They said, God said, build the Ark of the Covenant this way. And then we hear a description of what he said, build it like this and like that, with gold over here, right? And then over here we read, and then they built it like this and like that with gold over here. Now we would say, well, that's the announcement and the fulfillment, right? We're having a description of what God is commanding, and then we're having a description of how they're fulfilling God's command. But these source critics said, no, who would do that? That's silly. These must be two different sources. And they just walk through the texts like that. Form criticism looks at oral traditions, hypothetical oral traditions behind the texts, like parables. Where do the parables come from? Things of that nature. And then redaction criticism looks at the editorial process, all of which is hypothetical, none of which we know for sure. Right? The only thing we know for sure is the document we have before us and any of the documents that we find. So that's historical criticism in a nutshell. So Wellhausen did this. It was incredibly influential overnight. People started following his view all over the world. Now, how did this get into the English-speaking world? Well, through a figure I mentioned named William Robertson Smith. A lot of people neglect him. He's not actually that important as a biblical scholar. He did do work in biblical scholarship. He did do a lot of work. Was really pioneering in the early discipline of anthropology. Of course, his focus was in Arabia, because that's what he thought would be an important way of studying the Old Testament. And this goes back to Johann David Michaelis. Right? Michaelis actually helped come up with this expedition in Arabia. Why? Because we figured, if we want to understand what the Bible was like, the Old Testament, we have living examples, right? Nomadic Arabs in Arabia. Why don't we go study them? Then we'll learn about this biblical context. And their language of Arabic is probably even closer to Old Testament Hebrew than Hebrew that you might hear Jews reading and speaking. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but then it's pretty close actually to what they were arguing. So with William Robertson Smith, likewise. So he wanted to study the nomadic peoples, the Semites. Right? He has this book, Religion of the Semites. He did a lot of other books like that too. So he studied Arabia. His work is very important for early Semitic covenants and other things. He gets the family relationship and other things. So Smith becomes really important because this is, in a sense, where our discussion comes full circle, right? Think about it. Martin Luther in Germany, Protestant Reformation, arguing for dividing up the text. Some of these texts are less authentic than others or less inspired than others, etc. Paul didn't write Hebrews. Hebrews probably doesn't belong in the Bible, things like that. Luther did that. He said that, right? He changed his mind with Hebrews, maybe. But that's important to kind of keep in mind. John Wycliffe in England, putting the seedbeds of what becomes deistic biblical interpretation. And then what happens? The deists, like John Toland and others in England, really run with this. And they're just soaking up. They're inspired, they think, by the Protestant reformers. And they're taking it a step further. They're seeing this progress. And they're soaking up the religious skepticism of Scripture of the 17th century. Hobbes, but especially Spinoza and Father Richard Simon. And then what happens? We mentioned this in the last session. Through the work of Johann Zemler and Johann Michaelis, especially those two, all of this deistic English language biblical scholarship comes into the German world through their translations and their work. Zemler actually translated some of this deistic work. He did it for his teacher, Baumgarten, and others. And Michaelis translated Robert Loth's work. So they're bringing English scholarship into the German-speaking world, and it takes off. And I think one of the big reasons that it takes off is because of the institutional support they get at the universities, at the state-sponsored universities. And so now they don't have to worry about an individual patron. They have the whole state-run university system that gets the money from taxation. So it becomes this huge perpetuating thing. They don't have to worry about funding. They don't have to ask for money. They're not like the Institute of Catholic Culture or some Catholic organization that can ask for money or mendicant order or whatever. It's coming in from taxpayer money. It's there, right? So, that's something important to keep in mind. It's always there. They're not hungry. They don't have to go looking for it. It's there. And so that helps perpetuate and fund these projects. And some of these projects, they're expensive. These expeditions to Arabia, and they can't even rely upon the state funding. They have to get a wealthy nobleman involved and a prince to help back it. But they're getting all kinds of wild, expensive expeditions going on. It's very important. And so Germany takes that English criticism and just builds upon it. And now what's happening? Now, William Robertson Smith travels to Germany. He becomes a close personal friend of Julius Wellhausen. They write letters together later on. They correspond. And he agrees with Wellhausen. So he actually likes his work. He starts to be introduced to a number of other German biblical scholars and theologians, and they become friends. Now, why is this important? Because you may never have heard of William Robertson Smith before, right? If you've read Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, right? I'm not sure if he's in there, but he is in Three Rival Versions of Moral Enquiry, right? Alistair McIntyre's third book, which many of you probably have never read. Maybe Danny's read it. It's important, though. Why? Because if you haven't heard of Smith, I guarantee that almost everybody watching me has heard of one project he was intimately involved with. You may even have one of the recent collections in your home. That's the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? The most famous edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in the history of the world was the 9th edition, because the 9th edition included scholars from all over. I mean, huge, giant scholars, the top scholars from everywhere. William Robertson Smith began as the co-editor and then became the sole editor of the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you guessed it. He included Julius Wellhausen and a number of these German scholars in that volume. He had their works translated into English. So when it came to the history of Israel, Wellhausen got to include his theory of the history of Israel in an essay, a very popular essay. In fact, now, if you purchase, you can go online. It's for free. You can get it online for free. If you want to read Julius Wellhausen's Prolegomena of the history of Israel in English, it's available to you for free online, or you can buy an expensive copy. And it has his Encyclopedia Britannica article on Israel attached to it. And at least the edition I have has a foreword by William Robertson Smith. So this is very important. So Smith, he also gets some of these scholars like Wellhausen to write for English encyclopedias and other dictionaries beyond the Encyclopedia Britannica. So this Scotsman, William Robertson Smith, becomes one of the most important, not the only, but one of the most important sources for bringing German biblical scholarship, not just to the English-speaking world, because these scholars are publishing in journals that English scholars are reading, people are reading, right? At Princeton Theological Seminary, this is the heart of, the origin of the fundamentalist movement, self-identified fundamentalists at the dawn of the 20th century. They're reading Wellhausen in the original German. But through the Encyclopedia Britannica, now they're bringing Wellhausen into people's homes. Right? Hey, Dad, I got a question about Israel and this Old Testament thing. Let's look it up in the encyclopedia, son. And now you get Wellhausen's view articulated in his own words in your language. Does that make sense? Really important. So I think that's where I think if at this point in the drafting process in the Hahn and Morrow book, we're including this section here. I think it's important. It may not stay there in the end. We'll have to talk about that. But I think it's really important. And you'll see how this plays out. All right? So we need to transition, though, with the time that remains. I want to transition now. We do have time. How this gets into the Catholic world. And I'm not going to steer. I promise it's not likely that I will steal the thunder of your next speaker, because I'm focusing on the biblical scholarship here of one figure in the modernist controversy. I'm not going to give the whole history of the controversy. I'm going to focus on this figure, Alfred Loisy. I'll spell his, even though you have it on the phone, I'll spell it. Alfred Loisy. Very important figure. All right. Loisy was born in 1857. 1857. All right. It's 2 years before Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of Species in 1859. But he doesn't die until 1940. So it's a good-sized life, good long life. So he dies in 1940. So he lived a long time. He published an incredible amount. I mean, it's overwhelming. I work in Loisy scholarship. I've got a book coming out on Loisy from the Catholic University of America Press, and I haven't read everything that he's written. He's just written too much. He published something like 60 books. I mean, that's amazing, right? Articles, even more articles. He was prolific. He wrote a grammar of the Akkadian language that I'm not sure if it exists anymore. It was never published, and I don't know anybody that's ever seen it. But he wrote one. I mean, that's how this guy was prolific. So Loisy, I see as a real tragic figure. A lot of people describe him more like a demon. And then in the circles that I run in the academic scholarly circles of Catholics in the United States, not to scandalize you, but he's seen as like a saint, right? So in a lot of the circles I travel in, right, Pope Saint Pius X is seen as like the devil incarnate, the Antichrist, and Loisy is seen as the saint. And there's a reason for that. And I can't get into all the details here. And it's sad, but I think if you study the history, this is live, so but it's going to be staged. I have to be careful what I say. If you study the history leading into the 1960s and the 1970s into today, I think you're going to find a very similar history in the 60s and 70s of what was going on in the modernist controversy. They're related. It's not an accident. I'm a member of this La Société Internationale d'Études sur Alfred Loisy. Right? Should I write that? It's not important. It's the International Society of the Slave, Alfred Loisy. I'm the youngest guy there. I'm not even 40 years old yet. Okay. The next youngest person that's a major player in that society that does a lot of work, whom I work with, is getting close to 70. It's a huge time gap. My own doctoral advisor is over 70. He's a major figure in that group as well. The person who, the point is that there's a big age gap of the people who are actively involved. There's other members, but actively involved every year at the sessions. And what I notice is these scholars came of age in the 60s and 70s. A lot of them were seminarians. Some of them are still priests in good standing. Some of them were priests. Not the ones I'm talking about. But anyway, the point is that they came of age in the late 60s and early 70s. And that time period, if you listen to their stories, they describe what they experienced very much like how the modernists describe their stories. A lot of confusion, issues with formation, a lot of issues on a whole lot of levels. Again, I wish we had eyes to see what's going on behind the scenes at the supernatural level. We don't. But it's tragic. And I look back to the modernists, I see it's really a tragic time period. Very tragic. So Loisy, when I study this stuff, brings me so much sadness, and I pray for him and repose of his soul, because we want, don't have a lot of hope. He died outside of the church, right? And an avowed skeptic. Unlike George Tyrrell, his compatriot, Jesuit, was also excommunicated. They were excommunicated the same year, 1908. Tyrrell, at the end of his life, went to confession. They couldn't understand what he said, so they gave him conditional absolution. And then he was given, as he was going out, he was given another conditional absolution. But he was not given church burial because of the nature of their condemnation required an explicit repudiation of the positions they held. So juridically, it was a tricky issue. So we don't know anything about where these people are. But they didn't. It wasn't. It's a very tragic, not a positive time period. And so you have to keep that in mind. You're seeing a lot of hypocrisy among the clergy. There's formation issues. They're engaging with new ideas, and they're finding some of them attractive, and they're being told, "No, don't do that." And they're not being given tools to deal with what they're dealing with. So we're going to talk about a little bit of this. So Loisy was a Catholic priest ordained. And he studied with biblical scholars. One of the major figures he worked with was Ernest Renan. Renan is an important French skeptic, ex-Catholic. He was a major skeptic. He was a major figure bringing Wellhausen and the work of German biblical scholars to the French-speaking world. That's Renan. So Loisy received permission from his spiritual director to sit in Renan's classes. In hindsight, who knows if that was maybe not the best idea. He was working with this guy Vigouroux, Fulcron Gregoire Vigouroux, very important biblical scholar. I could say that publicly. People, I can defend it. People don't like that. A lot of modern scholars think Vigouroux was a nutcase, a simplistic, simple-minded Catholic apologist, a pretty impressive apologist. Great command of languages, scripture, ancient texts, science. He wrote on biology. He wrote on all sorts of things. But he didn't hold views that people now consider, he had trouble with certain forms of evolutionary theory as it was just getting on the ground. He thought Moses wrote the Pentateuch. There were all these things that are kind of forbidden in the academy. He defended traditions of the church, and he did a lot of apologetics. Well, Loisy had problems with some of the ways he did apologetics in the classroom. He didn't find them all very persuasive. Combine that with Loisy's studying with Renan, where he's getting to hear German historical criticism, the stuff we've been talking about, firsthand from somebody who uses it well and knows it very well. The one area he saw missing in Renan's work that he could have criticized Wellhausen for too was a lack of engagement with the material coming out of the ancient Near East, the Assyriological material, the remains of ancient Assyria and Babylon in their own language, Babylonian and Assyrian. So what did Loisy do? He went and he studied those languages and wrote a dissertation on the topic, on the royal annals of Sargon II. And he learned ancient Egyptian, he learned Akkadian, really mastered the Akkadian language and wrote a lot on that topic for a while. He became a professor of scripture at the Institut Catholique in Paris. And this is where he gets in trouble. He gets in trouble because he's using Wellhausen's views. He holds to a limited form of inerrancy, a limited inspiration. And he gets told by the secretary, Cardinal Rompala of Pope Leo XIII, to stop working in biblical studies. And actually, we have an account. Loisy wrote a lot about himself. So he wrote a short autobiography, Chose Passée, right? He wrote a much larger 3-volume autobiography of his memoirs, very involved. He wrote several autobiographies that he published in his lifetime. We could say a lot about that, but I don't want to psychoanalyze them. And in these, he mentions at one point, since Cardinal Rompala was just expressing the Pope's personal opinions, I decided to ignore it. It's really not the kind of thing you do. And he really narrates this as trying to avoid being excommunicated, laying low, and then once he gets excommunicated, he narrates that as a breath of fresh air, as a moment of liberation. So it's tricky to figure out what was he thinking early on. So he's writing this stuff, he gets in trouble. Then in 1893, Pope Leo XIII publishes Providentissimus Deus, the first papal biblical encyclical ever. And his main targets are Maurice Dulst, who I don't think I mentioned, right, the rector of the seminary in the Institut Catholique, where Loisy was teaching, and Loisy. So those are the two figures that were really at the heart of Leo's work. It was the main figures involved. He didn't name them. It wasn't a tradition. It was a tradition in papal documents not to name the people by name that you're dealing with. You want to deal with them privately, personally. You have concern for their souls, that sort of thing. And you recognize that there are broader movements out there. There are more people being influenced by what you're doing. So Leo sets up the Pontifical Biblical Institute to deal with this. The Pontifical Biblical Commission gets set up. And the Pontifical Biblical Commission starts with Loisy's former teacher, Vigouroux, at its head as secretary. It starts to address some of these issues, like the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, which it defends in 1906. Right? And then, so St. Pius X becomes Pope in 1903. Great catechist, and a concern. He's the one who lowers the age of Eucharist or reception. Great concern for the faithful. He's been getting wind of all of these movements going on at Catholic seminaries, by Catholic priests like Loisy and others. And he's very concerned for the harm this can do, right, for the faith, for the people. So in 1907, he publishes Providentissimus Deus, right? This is his, Pascendi Dominici Regis, Providentissimus Deus. I'm getting confused. It's late at night, past my bedtime. Pascendi Dominici Gregis, condemning modernism. Already prior to this, so this comes out in September. Already prior to this, I believe it's in July, I think it's on the outline, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, signed by St. Pius X, comes out with Lamentabili Sine Exitu. I'm typing this out, Sine Exitu. Same year, a few months earlier, which condemns propositions of the modernists. This is very interesting. Now the archival work has been done, and it's been published, and they've proved, they really proved, that this has come out of, some of it at least, Loisier's works. It's not only that lines are quoted from his works, but through the archival work they can see which documents they're taking it from. So they're actually taking some propositions from Loisier's published works and then condemning them. That's interesting. So he really is one of these major figures involved here behind the scenes. And then Pascetti Dominici Gregis comes out. And in that encyclical, Pius X, St. Pius X condemns modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. And it's a tricky document because you go through this, it says, if you hold one of these, you're guilty of holding them all. I mean, you might say, I might be guilty of holding some of them. One that I always come back to is, if you enjoy or if you like novelty in archaeology, well, define novelty in archaeology. I mean, I kind of like novelty in archaeology. So some of this comes down to how is this being defined? It gets a little tricky. And so these figures are trying to figure, is this, he's talking about me? Is he talking about me? Is he talking about you? Who's he talking about? And Lois, they kind of know he's talking about him. He knows that. Tyrrell, they know that. They're already getting in trouble with their bishop. Tyrrell's in trouble with the Jesuits. They're already getting in trouble. The following year, they get excommunicated. So Loisy is solemnly excommunicated. He actually finds out in the news prior to actually getting receiving his document. An interesting thing. And then he becomes the chair of the history of religion at the Collège de France, and that's where he retires from. And he dies in 1940. He publishes a tremendous amount, and he goes off the deep end. I mean, he starts to explain the origin of Christianity and Jesus and the resurrection based on the cult of Mithras, and he's influenced by this Belgian scholar, Franz Cumont, and all these stuff kind of happens. It's important to keep in mind, though, because I think this is what I would argue. I would argue that this time period is incredibly important for understanding the crisis in modern biblical interpretation in the Catholic world. Two major reasons. Right? One, it becomes the main entrance of this work into the Catholic world. I mean, these guys are taking, Friedrich Baron von Hugel, Loisy, all these figures are taking Wellhausen especially, and these others, and bringing them in, right? Loisy, Mark and Priority. Again, it's not that these individual issues are the death knell of the Catholic faith. They're not. But they get used in all these ways, and the doubt that gets placed on the tradition, we might say, is too quick. Okay, it's too quick. And they're not submitting to authority, etc. The same old story. But they're all doing this. So these seminary textbooks have become very popular. They're being used all over the United States of America, France, all over, Germany. So that's the number one, is this becomes amazingly influential in the Catholic world, forming Catholic priests. And then it goes underground. It doesn't really disappear. There's a very important book called, I think it's American Catholic Biblical Scholarship by Gerald Fogarty. Great historian, great history, great book. I don't agree with all of his conclusions and the ways in which he narrates the history, but if you just read the data, if you read the end notes, it's very telling. You get to hear about the archival work showing evidence that what some of these professors were teaching was one thing, and then with select students, and behind the scenes when they wouldn't get in trouble, they were teaching what was forbidden. And that's interesting. So that's always there under the ground. I don't think that ever dies away. And it starts to creep up little by little. You start to see scholars pushing the envelope in the 50s and in the 60s, and then it kind of reaches ahead and more controversies break out. And then they see themselves, they re-narrate the history so that they see themselves as being able to do this work. That's a whole other topic for another time. The second thing that happens is actually the response against the modernists. It becomes overly harsh, and it's not all done by the magisterium. You have this group that gets started this sodality of pious. It's just a kind of an unofficial group. And it's like a secret spy network. I mean, Dan Brown would have a hate. I mean, these fiction writers make up all this stuff. When you look at the history, there's real weird things going on that, are almost unbelievable, and yet they're true. And they would plant documents in professors' offices. They would steal material. They would do anonymous denouncements. It's like, the Washington Post and the New York Times of the day in France. The Washington Post wouldn't care when I was teaching in the classroom. But imagine that they did. And you're saying, Dr. Morrow, he's teaching that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. It's not what I teach. But anyway. But, and then then I would lose my job. That's what was happening, is they were making anonymous denouncements in the newspaper, and the next thing you know, people would lose their job. So it was a really crazy time period. Pope Benedict talked about this because his teachers were the next generation. And so he actually witnessed with his own teachers some of the challenges they went through. Actually, when Pope Benedict went for his second doctorate, what's called the habilitation, his Habilitationsschrift, his second doctorate in the theology of history in St. Bonaventure, he was required to remove a section of it because Michael Schmaus, the theologian as a reader on his committee, said, "No, this is a modernist thing. You can't have that. That's not allowed." So he actually had to remove part of his thesis. Pope St. John the 23rd, right, was removed. He was not allowed to teach church history anymore because they thought he was using Loisier's church history teacher, Louis Duchesne's textbook in class. So he becomes a bishop, Bulgaria. He gets appointed Pope John the 23rd. He goes into the Holy Office of the Inquisition, opens up his file, Angelo Roncalli, and it says, "We suspect Angelo Roncalli is a modernist." The one piece of evidence they had was he had been sent a postcard from an old seminary buddy of his who was a suspected modernist. That was it. So he pulls his pen out, and he writes, "I, John the 23rd Pope, declare I have never been a modernist." Okay? So this is just an important part of the history to keep in mind. There was an overreaction, a very popular overreaction. And they weren't given the tools in a lot of ways to deal with this stuff. So I think that the time was ripe, in a sense, in the 60s and 70s, for this to come back and for scholars to unquestionably take what was they weren't allowed to do, the methods they weren't allowed to do. They were primed to take this and just run with it as if this were the absolute truth. And there's a point I would make. There's a great book by Father Eugene Cavane. I think I mentioned this in the outline. It's called The Lord of History. It's not a well-known book. It's from the 1980s. It's a fantastic book. And he's got a supernatural vision to see the history. And he walks through Christian history, right? 20 centuries, focusing on this issue of the philosophy of history. But his section that deals with modernism is quite on point. And he gets, better than most I've seen, he gets the connection between what's going on in the 19-teens, 1907, 1908, really 1890 to 1914, and then what's going on in the 1960s and 1970s. He understands 68 with Humanae Vitae and Paul VI. He sees the connections. That's also the other book I mentioned, I think, in the first webinar. Unfortunately, it's only available in Spanish. I'm typing it out for you. Historia, some of you probably know Spanish. Historia Teológica del Modernismo. This was published in 1972 by Ramon Garcia de Haro. Probably shouldn't say this, but I will. Ramon Garcia de Haro, so I know a former student of his. Ramon Garcia de Haro is an Opus Dei priest at the University of Navarra. Navarra published this book, which is an excellent book. I know a former student of his, and he was told that Garcia de Haro was asked to work on this precisely because of the connections that were being seen between the fallout at the end of the 60s and early 70s and the modernist controversy. And the thought was, if Garcia de Haro could get a handle on the roots, the actual roots of the modernist controversy, they might be able to figure out what can be done now to help in the late 60s and early 70s, okay? Which in some ways was moot with the pontificates, right, of John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis, because of the focus on evangelization changed everything. It was a game changer. right? With a new evangelization, which Paul VI already announced. A real game changer, because we start seeing Catholic evangelization boom in Africa and Asia and all these places where it wasn't doing so well. It becomes amazing, where now it's Asia and Africa and Latin America have the world's majority of Catholics and Christians in general, right? So some of this is somewhat moot, but it's still there in the academy. I experienced this amongst scholars in the scholarly community. That's very important to keep in mind. So how does this play out? So what happens is two things. The Catholics are not allowed to engage in these methods. 1910, St. Pius X institutes the oath against modernism. If you're teaching at a Catholic seminary, if you're going to be ordained, right, to the priesthood as a deacon, if you are, any of these official roles, you have to swear the oath against modernism annually. And this goes into the Second Vatican Council, right? And so you're going to, and what part of what this oath entails is you're going to hold to the teachings of Lamentabili, Pascendi, the early decisions of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Paul VI changes the Pontifical Biblical Commission in the sense that prior to Pope Paul VI, the Pontifical Biblical Commission was a formal arm of the magisterium. It was part of the Pope's teaching office. You had to be a cardinal to be a member. It really was part of the magisterium. What Paul VI does, I think, in his wisdom, is he reconstitutes it. He sees the signs of the times. He says, this is dangerous terrain. He changes it. You no longer have to be a cardinal. And now it no longer has any authority. From 1972 onwards, the Pontifical Biblical Commission has no authority. It is simply an advisory committee to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Right? So now it's scholars who advise the CDF, which does have magisterial authority, right? But they can do with what they want with the PBC. So that's an important part of the history. But so the Catholic scholars are coming out, and what's happening? Nobody wants to play ball with them, right? They're scholars expected to do works of scholarship, and they're going to scholarly conventions, which are primarily run by Protestants, and they're being told, you're a Catholic. You can't do real scholarship. You've got to hold to these teachings of the Pope. You just got to say what the tradition says. How can you think for yourself? How can you engage in real scholarship? My response would be, read the biblical commentaries on St. Thomas Aquinas. If you don't think St. Thomas Aquinas can do real scholarship,